10% tariff on all over the world, 20% tariff on imports from the European Union, 34% on imports from China, and 46% on imports from Vietnam, with immediate effect at 401.
Right, so hold on. So that means
Jamaica exported 674 million to the US for the first 10 months of that.
So he's gonna have 10% tariff to anything where come from Jamaica.
Yeah, man.
We're selling at the US.
Yeah, man.
And Jamaica just pull 15% are trying to pull 15% TCP from what is coming from the United States.
And so I'm telling the minister, if a father got completely out of country, right?
But Ralston, we were saying going into the budget that the government must talk about Donald Trump now in the White House.
So watch the letter, them clueless. Because none of them spoke about that.
No. Nothing. Nothing.
Yeah.
And the journalist goes to the cabinet press briefing. Don't ask about this thing.
Not only the journalists, the so-called analysts, the bogus analysts, and so on. I have the journalists who are reporters, I have the bogus analysts.
All right, explain to my listeners how that 10% is going to affect Jamaica.
It is going to make Jamaican export to the US more expensive.
Right.
And the competition to sell in the US is going to be greater now because of the competition with more people who want a part of the scarce US dollar. So Jamaica will get left out because Jamaican goods are becoming more expensive than the people who Jamaicans are competing with.
So we used to, if we export one yam to the US, we export a little ackee. So that means our ackee now is going to be selling for 10% more.
Yeah, man. Everything that we sell is going to 10% will be added. We sell 674 million for them for the first 11 months of last year. And we'll be competing in the whole world because everybody has the 10% except China and European and Vietnam. So and their things are more, the prices for their things are cheaper than Jamaica because they have cheaper labor, cheaper money,
right?
Capital investment, larger scale production. Yeah.
So Marco Rubio coming to Jamaica did not save us?
No. I doubt that they raised the subject with them because I was saying to them that if they raise the subject to speak to Marco about those things, but they are so afraid and so tempted that they never raised. And the minister was in Parliament during the budget debate and yesterday talking about economic growth and she never said anything about those things.
So you think we're going to export less to America now?
But the trade deficit is going to get wider. Come on, man. That's natural man of the trading partner. Yeah, we have a lot wider trade deficit now, more pressure for the bank of Jamaica in terms of stabilizing the dollar for economic downturn. That is why I'm saying to you that the minister will have a father because she was talking about economic growth yesterday. Yeah, she never said anything about these things that would be happening now against the trading partner. And although everybody knew that this announcement was going to begin.
But we were all listening out for what Donald was going to say in the Rose Garden. She does sound like she did have that on her agenda.
No, she never even mentioned it. That's the point I'm making. I'm telling you how much these people are out of touch. How could you be a finance minister in a developing country where America is the greatest trading partner and you said nothing about what the dollar was doing while the markets have been selling off for weeks because everybody was awaiting what he was going to do with basic bread. These people are completely out of touch with reality.
Canada, they are reacting to that.
Yeah, man. Everybody reacting.
But can we react? Can Jamaica react?
The only reaction you can do is to lower the cost of energy and to diversify your trading partner.
Yeah, I think that Ralston Hyman is onto a very important matter, that we have to lower the cost of energy if we are to be competitive on the global market. I think many people who go to Jamaica, many investors, many capital investors have always suggested that Jamaica's energy cost is too high and therefore is not competitive with other countries. I don't know how we are going to do that, especially we're living in a situation in which the United States is seeking to overhaul the entire global system. And let us say, for example, that we were getting oil, energy cheaper from Venezuela, right? But we had to give up that because the United States was not particularly fond of the Caricom countries, and those in the Caribbean and Latin America at large. She was not very happy that we were dealing with Venezuela, even though we were trading at a marketable and also you know, energy efficient and also cheaper at least, not cheap, but cheaper than the world market would be able to afford us. Now, today we're going to look at the Trump tariff. And it's very interesting what is happening in our world. Now, what is happening in our world is not just merely about economics. We've got to look at the history. We've got to look at prophetic prophecy, right? The prophetic role of the United States in the last days event. If you're not following that, you will not understand one iota of what is happening with Trump and whether with Biden. Because, let us say that Ralston Hyman was, the Bell was asking Ralston, they did not prepare for Donald Trump in the White House, but did they prepare for Barack Hussein Obama? Did they prepare for Clinton? Because when Clinton came and he destroyed our banana trade, and remember now that the whole matter of FinCEN happened under the Clinton administration, and all of that globalization philosophy was attuned and contributed to what happened during FinCEN. You have to understand that, and if you don't, go and watch the film Life and Debt. There is a deliberate, should I say, ignorance played on behalf of some of these commentators as regards history, the role that history plays in what is happening in the US and around the world. Now, we have to look at economic history. You can't just look at numbers, and that's what we're doing during the pandemic. People are telling me that they're looking at, oh, I follow the data. What data? If you understood what was happening behind the scenes, then you understand that the data were not correct. You would have understood that. But because you were not willing to delve into other aspects other than the numbers, other than the stats, then most of you were fooled. You were tricked. You were deceived. But we have to understand that history plays a very fundamental role in everything that happens in our world. Dare us forget history, and then we are going to repeat the same mistakes and find ourselves in a worse situation than we found ourselves even previously in history. We've got to really become a grip of that. Now, when we talk about the post-World War II American economy that they forged, they are the ones who forged the post-World War II global economy. The United States was the one who forged that economy, and which, sort of created that architecture, the economic architecture, to benefit its growth and development. And we find that countries like Jamaica have always suffered from the huge gap between the rich and the poor, between the rich economies and the poor economies, ours being a very poor economy, that they have never been fair to us from the days of slavery. We understood, and what's his name this morning, Peter Esprit, wrote a very interesting article this morning in the Jamaica Gleaner, in which he suggested that during slavery, that we were the ones who produced the raw material, and it had to be sent for sugar and for just about everything. And it had to be sent to England to be refined and then sent back to us. And then we had to pay a higher cost because England decided to keep the machinery, the technology within its own borders, while not sharing that machinery, that technology with us. The same thing that they're doing right now. And we find that the technologies that the United States could have shared with Jamaica, with other countries, so we could produce our own stuff, they did not do that. They did that to China. They did that with China. And I'm not sure what is creating now this huge, brouhaha between the United States and China, when the United States shared even secret information with China and all the technologies that they could have possibly shared with them so that they could have been the #1 economy in the world. Trust me, the United States has played a huge role in fostering China to have become the #1 economy in the world. Make no bones about that. The problem I'm having, it seems, or the problem the United States is having right now, it seems like they outmatched them. They have outmatched them in their trickery, because the United States did not really want China to have become so, so popular and have grown in the way that it has grown. So now I think, seeing that it has been able to use its initiative, that's China, and its brilliance to have carved out an economy that is the strongest in the world, because it is the manufacturing hub of the world, right? And they have improved, they have lifted millions of their people out of poverty. Millions of their people out of poverty. The problem is that China is not a consumerist society, it's a productive society like America. Americans consume a lot. You go to their homes and you see they have all of these things that they don't need, the typical ones, and a lot of them can't afford it. So they put it on credit card, and then they accrue debt. And the same way the civilians behave, it's not much different from how the elites and governments behave. Remember now that governments emerge from the people, right? From the culture in which the people participate. So when we look at what is happening in the United States and their huge appetite for consumption, then we can see, then we can understand that the United States is not, its economy, its debt is going to be unsustainable. Why would somebody, for example, have 30 pairs of sneakers in their closet? For what? For what? Right? That is the typical household in the United States, particularly among us Blacks who like to consume, because in consumption, we think that we are superior. When somebody can come to our homes and we can show them all of what we have, and we are not looking at the fact that all of that is unsustainable, especially in an economy that is no longer producing. And yesterday I was listening to Jeffrey Sachs on Judge Napolitano's podcast, and in which he was suggesting that there's nothing for the United States to be upset about, because they are the ones who created this economic architecture in which the world is functioning. And that is true. But the fact of the matter is that when you look at what is happening to the United States, particularly as it concerns wars, we have to understand that wars are the greatest enemy of any economy, of any empire. It is going to, it is going to definitely destroy every section, every nook and cranny of the architecture that was built by the United States. Now, Trump has decided that he's going to impose 34% tax on all imports coming from China, 20% tax on imports from, countries like, I think I have China here, but it could be another country. I'm sorry about that. Or the European Union, right? So it's going to be 20% tax on imports from the European Union. For those of you who don't know, tariffs are just a very sophisticated word for taxes, right? So if you are paying $10 for an item in the United States, for example, and they have imposed 10% tax on it, then you should calculate it in terms of that, in terms of the increase. So all of the tariffs and the taxes will result in increase. The increase will be passed on to consumers. Now, 20% on all imports coming from the European Union, 25% on imports coming from South Korea. Now, South Korea is supposedly an American ally, isn't it? 24% tariff on Japan, and 32% tariff on Taiwan. Now, if you want to hear in the Caribbean, for example, well, luckily Jamaica only has 10% because we don't import anything of any great significance. Ironically, it is the countries who import the most and who are more productive that the United States seeks to attack and is imposing a lot of taxes on. That's ironic. So it means, therefore, the United States does not want any country in the world to be more productive than she is. And if America is not producing, then the rest of the world should not produce. If America is poor, then the rest of the world should be poor. And this is the sort of draconic behavior that we are witnessing in the United States as we speak. Now, we understand that in Ghana, for example, 38% of taxes in imports, so the US has slapped 38% tariff on all exports coming from Guyana. Now, I think there are some exceptions, oil, and I think there's another thing, oil and there are some products, oil, bauxite, and gold are exempt from US tariffs. That's so in Guyana this morning, the papers reported that oil, bauxite, and gold are exempt from US tariffs. I'm happy that I wrote it down here because sometimes I do forget what I've read. I've read, I read so many papers that it's always very difficult to remember everything that I have read. So that's good news for Guyanese that oil, bauxite, and gold will be exempt from US tariffs, but all other Guyanese goods going to the United States will be slapped. A 38% tariff will be slapped on those goods. Now, Trump declared a national emergency. We find now where the presidents of the United States, in almost everything they do, are declaring national emergency. We had national emergency for 9/11. I think there a national emergency for the global meltdown. I can't remember. I don't think so. Maybe the fact that they were able to pay off all these bankers who actually contributed, who created the problem in the first place. Maybe that was a national emergency for using taxpayers' money to give to the banks who created the problems, to give to Wall Street. So that could have been a national emergency because they were suggesting that, the economy was going on the toilet. And people believe it. And telling me what Obama did to have saved the economy. Obama did not save the economy. Obama destroyed the American economy. If Obama had the testicular fortitude, he would have been able to say, no, all of these monies have to be invested into the civilian economy, in creating jobs for Americans, because the bankers and the Wall Street economic elites are the ones, through their deregulation philosophy, who destroyed the American economy in 2008. Remember now that under Bill Clinton and his tethering himself to the neoliberal agenda, he deregulated the American economy. So there were no regulations in terms of, ensuring that these elites do not, pass their places and do not create the sort of debt trap that we saw them creating in 2008, which resulted in the economic collapse. So let's go back to the emergency. So emergencies were created again 2019, 2020 during COVID. We had an emergency. Now, what I think Biden did to the medical industry, the medical infrastructure of the United States, because the medical infrastructure of the United States will never be the same. It has been destroyed during COVID. It will never be the same, right? Likewise, Trump, in his mandate, is now destroying the economic infrastructure. But let's go back to history. Let's go back to economic history. So we talk about the post-World War II Bretton Woods Agreement and financial infrastructure. And that was created, I think, was in 1944 that Bretton Woods was actually inked out, was carved, and implemented throughout the world, at least throughout the West. Now, that created a situation in which the United States was at the helm because it had emerged out of World War II as the victor. All of the European economies had been, they just had declined, they had been smothered to ashes, and they were not able to resuscitate without the help of the United States of America. So America was able, through the Marshall Plan, to rebuild Europe. And as a result of that, it rebuilt Europe in its favor. that Europe would have to follow everything that the United States does and that the United States instructs that it does. Remember now, people are still thinking that Europe is independent. It's not sovereign. Right after World War II, Europe actually became just a, what we call it now. I forgot the word now that I'm trying to look for. It became a satellite. That's the word I was looking for. It became a satellite of the US, which means therefore the US runs the show, whether it's in Germany, whether it's in England, whether it's in Italy. And if you study the history of Italy and see how during Mussolini, the Wall Street financiers were so much involved in that sort of fascist state that he built, you would be shocked. You would be shocked, particularly since 1920s onwards, and US's role in fascism in Italy, in modern Italy. You would be shocked. So when we talk about Trump and Trump is this fascist, we must understand that all empires are fascist. And that's why you had the fasci during the Roman Empire. And Bush actually said, we are the new Rome. That is what Bush said. And Bush also said, I'm just paraphrasing him now, that he would have preferred if he were a monarch, if he were a king, than to be a democratic president, because then he could get whatever he wants to get done. And if you read what happened after 9/11 and the command that he gave people like the Donald Rumsfeld and so forth, you'll be shocked to see what these guys have done. But I just wanted here to read something that James Madison, one of the architects, I think people describe him as the major architect of the US Constitution. Brilliant man. He says, of all the enemies of true liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded, because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the dominion of the few. Taxes are the main instruments for bringing the many, that is the majority, under the domination of the few. Think about that. So what are we living in, therefore? Are we living in a democracy in which the majority, in which the many, so-called the many, are influencing how decisions are made in Washington, how decisions are made in Kingston and around the world? No, we're not. We're living in an oligarchy. We are living in an oligarchy. And what Trump has done really is to unmask that oligarchy for us. Before, the Democrats, they have lots of oligarchy in their parties. According to Chris Hughes, I think he calls them corporatists. I don't distinguish between corporatists and oligarchs. He has his definition, and I'm not going to knock him, right? But Chris Hedges has, described this war that you're seeing in the United States between the corporatists, which he says belong to the Democratic Party, and the oligarchs, which he suggests belong to the Republican Party. That is what Chris Hughes has intimated. I'm not going to knock him. That is his. I do not differentiate, as it were, between the oligarchs and the corporatists. They're the same, right? Aren't they? Okay, so let's go now to some other major. Let me see if I could share some other information with you. Okay, so we're going to look at some other information here. We see where American oligarchy and the myth of development. American oligarchy and the myth of development. Before I go there, please make sure you like and you share and you subscribe, right? Please like the videos so the videos can be shared with as many people as possible. Don't be selfish now. We need to share the video with as many people as possible so that we can be able to spread truth along, because there's no other way to spread truth than just liking. That's how the system works. If you don't like the videos, you don't comment, then the videos are not going to be shared. It's going to be just it's going to be hidden on the platform. That's how it works with YouTube and all of the major platforms like TikTok. Now, let us look at tariffs and smariffs and smariffs. Yeah, I think that this is like he's suggesting that I think is his term that he has, coined for tariffs, schmariffs. Yeah, let me show you what the word is. Schmariffs, tariffs or schmariffs. All right, so let's go here where we have, well, we won't be played for suckers by Laos and Liechtenstein anymore. That's the load of my mind. As of Tuesday, Laotian imports will come complete with a 48% tariff. 48% tariff, that's a lot. As for Liechtenstein, it will only be 37%. What, you may wonder, did Laos and Liechtenstein do to cause the drop in domestic production here in the United States? Very good question. And to build a world economy based on the global capital's free trade. Are they major producers and of governmental or governmentally subsidized exports to our shores? Did they play a key role in building the World Trade Organization? These are very important questions that we're not asking. And yes, we need to ask these questions because who created the World Trade Organization and also installed China in 2001 into this World Trade Organization, which they knew that the other countries could not compete with China, including the United States, because China has a huge population. Did they lobby our Congress to pass NAFTA and permanent normal trade relations with China? Did they make under the table payoffs to the board members to Apple to relocate a chunk of its Chinese production to other Southeast Asian nations once Chinese wages had risen well above those in its less developed neighbors? Actually, no. Right? Actually, no. They did not participate in these things. It's the United States which made and which crafted the rules for the global economic order that we find ourselves in. And I think we are at stage 4. People are talking about, the post-Bretton Woods and the post-World War order, but then we went into the 1970s when the United States also removed monetary currencies from being attached to gold, rather, right? From being attached to gold. Remember now that if you had currencies in your bank accounts, then it will have to be aligned, attached to gold in terms of, you can't go over that, the gold reserves that you had in your bank reserves. But now we find that we have created this sort of money out of thin air, this fiat currency that we're having, which is not real. Or dollar is not real, whether it's American dollars or because it's not backed by any currency, anything like silver and gold, right? It's not backed by that. So that's why you find that the Federal Reserve can just go and they can print money. Before 1970s, they couldn't do that, right? Because they would have to count the amount of gold reserves that they have, that they had in the treasury before they could print money for whatever occasion that they were printing money for. Okay? So we find ourselves in a world in which 1970s was the second stage, and we move to another stage. Now, I think the third phase of globalization, because I think it started with the International Monetary Fund and the Bretton Woods institution at the World Bank in 1944. Then we had the transition of moving from, tethering your gold reserves to cash in the 1970s. In 1971, when President Nixon came off the gold standard. And then I think the third phase was under the Clinton era, when the United States now created this whole matter of globalization, and he deregulated the market. And we found that most of the factory jobs in the United States, manufacturing jobs, were shipped out to other countries. It really changed the economic fabric of the United States of America. Then now, after the Clinton era, let's fast forward to the Bush era, in which we had the financial meltdown, the Bush-Obama era, I should say. Okay? And Obama came now, and what did he do? He continued the deregulatory agenda. And instead of sanctioning, disciplining the banks and the investors, the equity investors who created the problem in the first place, who created the financial collapse of 2008, he rewarded them, he incentivized them, and caused many Americans to have lost their retirement and their investments. Now, may I suggest here this morning that Trump now is on the fourth agenda. And he's about now to refashion, as it were, to remold again the economic structure by just tearing down that wall of globalization and making it in favor of only US interests. Right? And that is what we're seeing. Now, I would like to ask the question, is Trump using tariffs to buy off countries and to buy off their resources, their natural resources? It could be. Maybe they can negotiate with him, but if should they negotiate with him, for example, in Jamaica, what if Trump wants to have a large, contingency of Haitians to go to Jamaica or to go to the Dominican Republic, which they would not want, but if they want to forego the 10% tariffs, then they would have to do it. Or if they want a particular military base in the Dominican Republic or in Jamaica or wherever, then they can get it. Whatever resources that the US might not have been able to get through democratic process, then they would afford it, they would get it, they would garner it through the imposition of taxes that Americans would find, well, the natives of those countries would find very difficult to sustain. They would find it very onerous to sustain. I think it could be both. That this is not only a tariff, it's about more than economic control. It's about political and military control of the countries around the world. And we can see that Trump wants to buy Panama, Greenland, among other countries. So, look at Guyana, for example, in which they have the ExxonMobil deal. And even though Guyanese have been suggesting that it's not in favor of them, the agreement inked out is not in favor of them. In fact, there was a lady on CNN who suggested that even though Guyana grew in 2023, their GDP grew by 33% in 2023. Guyanese GDP, the GDP of Guyana, grew by 33% in 2023 and 40% in 2024. But the Guyanese are saying that the cost of living is higher and they are not benefiting from what the ExxonMobil oil agreement with the Venezuelan government. They are not benefiting. And I would like to pull up that one of these days. I'm not going to put it up here because sometimes they, shadow ban your videos when you pull up videos and say that it's not going to be monetized and whatever. So I'm very scared of putting up people's videos, but she was on CNN. I can't remember her name, in which she was expressing the Guyanese plight in terms of the exploitative agreement that Guyanese went into with ExxonMobil. Now, let me end here, and I'm saying please like, share, and subscribe. Please like, share, and subscribe. May I suggest also that the government of Jamaica, people, Ralston, Hyman, and Bell were suggesting that Andrew Holness has not, addressed the whole matter of the tariffs. And I would say that, that's not true to an extent, because in this morning's paper, in the Gleaner, they were saying that, like a pivot to tariffs, that was the title of the piece. And he was suggesting that Jamaicans should look for more markets, for new markets than the US, so that they can be more competitive and they don't have to depend on US market alone. Now, that is going to be determined also on Trump and what he thinks, because I don't think Trump wants to have our economies grow. He wants to cripple them so that the United States can control these countries more. Okay? That is what you have to understand. Now, why did Marco Rubio go to Jamaica? Why was he there? Was he there to talk about the Cuban doctors? Or was the main agenda to talk about Chinese and Chinese investment in the Caribbean? That's the question that we need to ask. And many of our journalists did not ask these questions. They preferred to ask some little questions that really did not matter, was of minor consequence. And that could have been left up to a lawyer in terms of the green card and all of that stuff. But one of the things that is very important here is that Caribou from Area FM also suggested that she doesn't believe that Marco Rubio's visit to Jamaica had to deal with or had to do with the Cuban doctors' employment. She doesn't believe that. She thinks that it had more to do with US foreign policy towards China and the fact that the Chinese are visible in the Caribbean region. And I would want to believe that is true. You know why? When the question of China came up, Marco Rubio almost lost his composure. He almost lost his composure. He had to regain his composure because, you know, evidently he is anti-China and has always been. Marco Rubio has always been antagonistic against Chinese growth and development. So I think that that is what is true. Now, in suggesting that, remember to like, share, and subscribe, like the videos so that videos can be shared. The Gleaner opened up, I think it was on April 1, 2025, with the question, foreign policy and China. Foreign policy has figured little so far in the simmering campaign for Jamaica's general election, which has to be held by the end of this year. So even the Gleaner is acknowledging that we're not talking about geopolitics, that we're not talking about foreign policy. And I have been doing that on this channel, and you have been saying, wow, what is this guy talking about? He's weird. Because you don't know what you're talking about. And you think that Andrew Coleman talking about Portmore becoming a parish is something of mention right now. It's a distraction. Who cares if Portmore become a parish at this moment? We have other bigger fish to fry. Now, let's look at but I hope I'm not, my thing is not, is turned in. You know, let me see if I could plug in this thing, because it's going to go topsy-turvy. So that is what we are suggesting in the whole Chinese situation. We don't know, as it were, if this meeting had to do with the Cuban doctors, or that's the meeting with Marco Rubio and Andrew Pones, or the role of China in the Caribbean region. We can see what is happening in Panama, that already BlackRock has, or is in the process of buying off the Panama Canal, right? So even though Panama was standing up to the United States, or pretended to have been standing up to the United States, and so we are not going to, you know, buy or sell our sovereignty, in the final analysis, Panama had to do it. So when you're thinking that the Mia Motleys and the Andrew Poduses and the Ralph Gonzalez are standing up to the United States, you are going to see very shortly that these are the boys and girls at the altar, right? Now, isn't it amazing that Mia Motley has not spoken out? She's so brilliant and so eloquent on matters in terms of, now she's not a trained economist, but she was Minister of Finance in her country. So she has some experience in terms of how the Barbadian economy is going to, you know, what the challenges that the Barbadian economy is going to face. And at large, by extension, Caricom economies. But you haven't heard anything from her. Well, I haven't heard anything. Have you? Right? Is she challenging Trump and talking about the inequity of the economic global order? Is Mia Mottley doing that? Or why is she so silent? And she talks about these things a lot ad nauseum at the United Nations. Why is Mia Mottley so silent? But maybe she's preparing herself, and we have to be fair to her. Maybe Mia Mottley is preparing her her speech, right? So that she can be thorough and she can look very important. Now, there is an article that I would like to share with you. I know the video might be a little long, but it's very important that you learn, right? It's very important that you learn. All of this, 8 minutes video and whatever is not serving you, right? You have to. Now, before we go on to an article, let us continue with what the Gleaner is saying, but it's a proverbial elephant in the room, particularly in how Jamaica navigates its relationship with the United States and China. The question can't be ignored for much longer, especially after last week's swing through 3 Caribbean capitals, including Kingston, by the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. Mr. Rubio was generally affable, appearing willing to cut regional countries some slack, to continue with perhaps minor tweaks their government-to-government program of using Cuban doctors and nurses in their health systems. Mr. Rubio had characterized the scheme as human trafficking and threatened sanctions, including the withdrawal of U.S. travel visas against officials involved in it. But I think the Gleaner is getting at the fact that it's much bigger than that the meeting was much bigger than that the United States is seeking to dethrone China as a major investor in the Caribbean and Latin American region. Listen to the Gleaner now quoting Marco Rubio. Our problem is predatory practices. That's when the question was asked, what, is the United States' perception of China in the region? Our problem is predatory practices, he said. And oftentimes, if China products or projects comes attached with a huge loan that can never be repaid, and now they hold it over your head forever, right? And that is what Rubio said during his visit to Jamaica. And he was he was angry when the whole question of China was presented to him. But let's go to a very brilliant scholar from Guyana. He's actually a professor at the University of Berkeley, I think, University of California, Berkeley. I think that is where he lectures. And by the way, I find that the commentary and the news reports coming out of Trinidad, not that they're excellent, but they're superior to what is coming out of Jamaica. They are superior to what is coming out of Jamaica in the Gleaner and also the Jamaica Observer. Even their papers are much more user-friendly than the Jamaica Gleaner. The Jamaica Gleaner needs to change its image online. It looks horrible, and they need to upgrade that image, but they don't care. But neither is that image good, the physical image not good, but it's also their image in terms of the presentation of the news is not very good. The Gleaner has fallen, and I don't know how lower that the Gleaner and the Observer can get. I don't know. But the Trinidad and Guardian, and to an extent the Trinidad Express, do present the news in a much more nuanced and professional manner than the Gleaner and Observer do. Now, let's look at American Oligarchy and the Myth of Development by Percy Hinzen. And he is a native of Guyana. He is Professor Emeritus at the University of California, Berkeley, and until recently was a Professor of Global and Sociocultural Studies in the School of International Public Affairs at Florida International University. So let me see if I can make the screen bigger so that I can be able to read. And I think I want to share the screen with you because he has some very important points here that he has mentioned in his speech, right? Remember, now that we're looking at development of the Caribbean, or the lack of development, I should say, and the region in general by extension. Now we have here during the 19th or the 1950s and 60s, development economist Walt Rostow and Arthur Lewis, a very well-known Peruvian economist, Arthur Lewis, convinced governments of the global South that dependence upon Euro-America is the only path to what Rostow termed the takeoff to economic maturity and high mass consumption. And notice that Arthur Lewis is a celebrated economist in Jamaica and around the world, in the Caribbean at large. They celebrate him, they worship him. You go to any Caribbean economic conference and they're going to celebrate him, even though his view is highly colonialist. And you'll not hear the people like the likes of the Karen Coopers and these people who think they talk about blackness and colonialism. They won't talk against him. She won't. And we bought it. Lewis, a West Indian from St. Lucia, received a knighthood from Britain and the Nobel Prize in economics. And the same thing for Professor Rex Netterford. He didn't have any development plan that was great. Nothing. Because he was also knighted. Right? And there were the boys of the Queen. The little knights of the Queen, right? That she actually, at the time, bestowed her benevolence on. This should have been a warning to us in the Caribbean that the project of economic growth and development was no more than a facade for the continuation of colonialism. Development became the episteme regnant, the reigning doctrine of economic policy and practice in the global South. Today, most of the world's population is yet to see its realization. We are much worse off despite the trappings of mass consumption made possible by imports from the global north and now China that we pay for by borrowing at exorbitant interest rates. We are mired in a perpetual and escalating debt crisis, what people call the debt trap. Rostow and Lewis were writing on the cusp of a global shift to an American-centered imperialism, right? That's what they were writing. And they knew that America had now arisen on the scene and was going to take over from where the British had left off. So the large portion of our academic system in the Caribbean, if you're studying economics, no matter what you're studying, is largely tethered to colonial ideologies and philosophies. And that is why we are not building, we are not developing. And that is why also we rejected the philosophies of Marcus Garvey, because they would definitely be in conflict with the philosophies coming out of our universities. Initial challenges led by the Warsaw Pact countries headed by the Soviet Union and a Euro-communist alliance in Western Europe forced American restraint for a while. Eastern Europe, Cuba, and China provided support for third world socialism in the global South. But our profligate borrowing finally caught up with us, exploiting a generalized debt crisis. The United States Department of Treasury coordinated and formulated a Washington consensus with the IMF and World Bank. Together, they imposed structural adjustment, reform, and austerity measures on almost every country in the global South. This was the most critical element in a transformation to an American-centered project of neoliberal globalization. Now, make sure that you like and you share and you subscribe. It was backed by military, economic, and political intervention aimed at preempting and defeating any challenges to American power. It led eventually to the collapse of the Warsaw Pact alliance and the unraveling of the Soviet Union. So was Donald Trump in office at this time? No. The Americans have always been imposing their economic worldview upon other countries, even when their economic worldview and philosophy might conflict and might paralyze, as it were, the economies of the global South. Something you must understand. Don't believe everything you see that Donald Trump is the problem, because Donald Trump is only the symptom. He's a typical US president. Meanwhile, we in the global South were being told that it was our fault, that development didn't work, and we believe it. that we were locked in the waiting room of tradition and underdevelopment because of our own corruption, inefficiencies, inadequacies, incapacities, and moral failures, that they were superior to us and that they were less corrupt than we are when they're not. That we were led astray by our irrational commitment to dirigism, dirigism, meaning the adaptation of socialist, I don't know, I've never met this word before, inspired forms of government organized around the state control of the economy. We swallowed this argument hook, line, and sinker, notwithstanding the considerable successes enjoyed by the democratic socialist dirigism policies of Western Europe. I note in passing that the phenomenal success of China was built precisely on a most extreme form of dirigism. So was colonialism. State control of the economy was the rising debtor of colonial governance. The state control, you have to have some control by the government. You can't just say you leave it up to the markets. And even when Trump came out with his tariffs, the people there were in the news media, they were, oh, wow, the markets are going haywire. Who cares if the market goes haywire? Because the markets are artificial. It has nothing to do with anything. We have to make a reality or economies. We have to fashion them. We have to carve out our economies linked that, and they should be linked to the real realities of the people, right? Because all of this global war that you're seeing, this trade war that we're witnessing, what you're seeing are the elites who have their different, modus operandi in terms of how they're going to usher in the new world order. But they're not doing this for you. They're not seeking to develop the economy for you. They're seeking to develop the economy for themselves. And that is what you have to understand. What Trump is doing is not to make America great in terms of the citizens, is to make America great in terms of its imperial ambitions and its empire, its global military empire. I hope you're understanding it. All some of us did when we secured political independence was to transfer such control over to our own governments. This was the only means available to us if we were to gain, reclaim, and control the right to ownership of our national assets and to determine the conditions of their use. In this, we took our cue from Western European countries that were busy adopting policies of ownership and control of the commanding heights of their respective economies. Our own Caribbean economists, Thomas Gervin Beckford, joined with Latin American dependency theorists to beg our acknowledgement that the so-called developed industrialized economies of the global north were built on the backs of colonial expropriation and exploitation. And I remember Gervin very well, right? Very brilliant Jamaican economist. This was the crux of the matter. There can be no development without our resources and our labor anywhere. And that is the crux of the matter. And that is what Trump is seeking, I believe, to negotiate our labor and our resources. Okay. They expose the bad faith of orthodox economists with all their talk of savings and investments derived from a Harold Domar model, cooked by up almost 100 years ago by two dead white men. There can be no savings and investments without resources and labor, period. The United States fashioned the post-World War global order into a project of political, economic, and military intervention to maintain, sustain, and globalize its project of colonial exploitation, expropriation, and subordination. That's what it did, right? It doesn't believe in democracy. And in its contemptuous cynicism, it labeled the project Pax Americana, right? Because that's what it is. You had like Pax Romana. We're now in the Pax Americana. The American era, that's what it means, the American century. Right? A central feature of colonialism is political and economic domination by a merchant plantocracy located both in the colonies and the colonial center. So we can see the plantocracy in Jamaica. And everything that they say is linked to what the plantocracy in these metropolitan states suggest and policies that they advocate. This plantocracy exercised control over all aspects of production, trade, commerce, finance, and communication. Pax Americana laid the groundwork for its globalization. So all of this infrastructure that we're seeing that Trump is building on was already laid from 1944, from the creation of the post-World War global economic structure and order. It has nothing to do with Trump. It has nothing to do with Trump. It has to do with the US military industrial complex and the US empire. ExxonMobil has become the current colonial overlord of Guyana, and America its new colonizing power. The imperative of export-led GDP growth generated by what economists call foreign direct investments, supported by development aid, continues to fuel a cruel myth that oil is our new Deus ex machina, meaning a sudden and unexpected appearance that solves an unresolvable and intractable problem. Oil has blinded us to the fact that what has sustained Guyanese are remittances from those who have immigrated primarily to the United States, together with the significant revenues generated in the informal economy. It's not through tourism or it's not through the oil that they're suggesting. And because as I told you, the Guyanese economy grew in 2023 by 33% and in 2024 by 40%, the GDP, but it has not translated into the prosperity of the Guyanese people. In fact, in Guyana, they're saying the cost of living is way beyond the roof, and the people are suffering. To these must be added the yeoman contributions from our farmers and fisher folk who could teach our political leaders, policy makers, and economists a few lessons about economic self-sufficiency, sustainability, and security. Because the people who are coming from Oxfords and the Harvards are not going to develop our economy. The people who are graduating from Harvard, from the Harvard Finance School, and they went and they got their masters and whatever they have, their MBAs, and from Oxford, like the likes of, what's his name? Rex Metaphor. They don't have any, or he didn't have any plans for development other than which he had learned at Oxford. Okay. We need to ask ourselves, why is it that Guyana remains the fifth poorest country in the entire Western Hemisphere and the second poorest in the South America and the Caribbean, while it enjoys what some are saying is now the highest GDP per capita in Latin America? Thought Jamaica was the second, but I think Ghana has beaten us, so maybe we are number 3, right? We are in the unenviable position of number 3. All oil has done is to make the country credit worthy. Very important point he's making here. Now, we can sink even further into the debt trap. Recently, the government secured a $527 million loan from the U.S. Export-Import Bank, EXIM, for investment in a gas-to-energy project. The mission of EXIM, the official export credit agency of the United States, as boldly and proudly emblazoned on its website, is to support, I quote, American job creation, prosperity, and security through exporting, unquote. The government of Guyana has agreed to a loan repayment totaling $1 billion beginning in 2031. So, let me get this straight. Guyana will repay the United States $1 billion, $1 billion for a loan of $527 million acquired from its export credit agency, whose declared objective is to support American job creation, prosperity, and security. What about us? If there's anything that the Guyanese people need and Americans have in abundance, it is job creation, prosperity, and security. All right? That is what they need. I'm not going to bore you to death. All right. But I would admonish you, if you can, to read this article. It's written by, let me go and get his name again, by, I will attach it to in the description. American Oligarchy and Myth of Development by Percy Hinson. Hintzen. Percy Hinson, Hintz or Zen. Right? Yeah. Let me just end here with this quote from the last paragraph. People in the global south have been seduced by a promise that the route to development is GDP growth. They willingly gave up their precious resources, accommodated themselves to conditions of sheer life, low wages, and vast inequality, while becoming increasingly dependent on goods and services that they were not allowed to produce, could not afford, and did not need. Right? In the face of inevitable failure, many abandoned their countries to provide cheap and exploitable essential labor to the global north. Their governments rejected sustainable alternatives organized around domestic production and mutually beneficial forms of equal exchange for their exports. Now we are in the throes of a new transnational order of oligarchic colonialism, where a cadre of billionaires and multimillionaires, I should say, have assumed direct control of the US government. Their declared goal is acquisition of new territory, Greenland, Canada, Panama, Gaza, and deployment of American power to coerce and control the others into submission in pursuit of their exclusive, accumulative interests. Those who are not usable to them are being abandoned to fend for themselves, even in the United States. Seduced by their governments into the promise of development, people in the global south now find themselves trapped by the bad faith of development economics. Booker's Guyana has now morphed into ExxonMobil Guyana, right? So if it's in Jamaica that they're coming to drill oil, they're not there to drill it for the development of Jamaica and Jamaicans. They are there to drill it for the development and the enrichment of the global oligarchs. That is what we have to understand. Whether it's the IMF or the World Bank or ExxonMobil or any equity firm that you see in Jamaica, the stock market, they're not there to develop your economy, because we're still in a capitalist economy, as far as I know. And it's still, there's no new economic philosophy in terms of how are you going to be able to not produce in a capitalist country, to have a manufacturing economy, to have a manufacturing base. You've got to have a manufacturing base if you are going to be in any way prosperous. But we have not created a manufacturing. In fact, we have demolished our manufacturing base in the 1990s in Jamaica. And now that China is now the hub of the manufacturing base in the world, the United States is seeking to crush her. But as I suggested to you, it seems to me that it's more of a fight amongst the oligarchs and the corporatists, as Chris Hedges has suggested, right? I don't think that's about us. I think if we are going to develop, if you are going to carve out an economy that is going to be prosperous for you and your children and your grandchildren, the responsibility lies with us. It's not going to be our government. Our governments are no longer representing us. We, the people, have got to stand up. We've got to demand that they show us what really is happening and that we don't support their attachment, they're being tethered to the global oligarchs or corporatists, that we are not sending them to the White House or to Gordon House, right, to craft policies that are in sympathy with the global and domestic oligarchs or plantocracy. That is my message to you. I hope that you like, share, and subscribe. Remember now that we are going to be affected by what is happening, and I think that Jamaica is essentially will become more impoverished. Thank you so much for joining. Hope that you have learned something. Begin now to read. You have to read on the role of the American empire in last day's events, and also read books of economies, the history of economics. Because if you don't know the history of economics, you're not going to understand. You could have gotten a PhD. You don't have a solid history, which many economists don't, in terms of how our economies have evolved. Then you are not going to be able to understand what is happening. All the best to you. See you there.